Hey everybody, welcome to another upgrade video. For all you Magnepan guys out there and all you folks who love Magnepan speakers, this is your video. I have been sent a pair of Magnepan 3.7i straight from the factory. They're nice, and we were commissioned to see what we could do with these and install or build everything. And normally I do not take assembly work. We just don't have time for it, and it delayed this whole project because it was a lot for us to have to deal with that is outside of what we ordinarily do. We're really not set up to do a lot of this work, especially on something this big. But I felt like it was important to show exactly what's going on inside of these and how to go about doing the upgrade for those of you who own these already and you want to tackle this project. It's a bit of a project. It's not simple. The tough part is not the new crossover or anything that involves what we designed. The tough part is the disassembly of the whole speaker and being able to work on it and put it all back together and all that stuff. So we took some photos of it and took some measurements on it and marked with an ink pen with red ink on the terminal so we could see exactly which ones were positives and negatives and things like that. So we wanted to kind of catalog the process of a little bit. So we agreed to take on this job, and it was quite a job, and because of the amount of workload we had right now in the last months and how much we were dealing with new product and getting tweeters in and air freighting stuff in and everything else, it was tough to work this stuff in. And so I apologize to the owner of these. I know we took a little extra time on these, but the result is going to be really worth it on this thing. So let's start from the beginning where we start on this stuff when it comes in the door. First we had to unpackage the whole thing, mount the base to it, set it up on a little lift table, get it up off the floor, and start taking measurements and looking at it at different distances and different measuring heights and looking at it left to right and trying to find the right axis to measure these things. So let's look at the first measurement that we took here, and there's a couple of measurements on there. The first one in red was the measurement we took in the center of the panel. So we were about 60 inches away, and the microphone is right in the center of the panel. And as you can see from the looks of that red line, little bit rough. And trust me, we moved to different distances. We moved much further back, closer up, tried to find the sweet spot, tried to see if does it make much difference. Where do we need to be to know what we need to know? And we also had to take into account there's going to be some room interaction in the measurement. There's some reflection that we're not completely gating out. And we had to know how much of that was room and how much was not room. So we took measurements close up and then further away and changed the gating so that we could see exactly how much may have been contributed to the room. Some of the responses you'll see have little wiggles in them. That's late arriving reflections that were not gated out. But overall, we were able to get pretty accurate measurements and see exactly what's going on. All right, looking at that same measurement again. The next measurement, you see a line, or the next line on the graph is green, and that was on the tweeter axis. So we just moved from the center of the panel over to the tweeter axis from that distance, and it changed pretty dramatically. So I thought, oh boy, we got stuff going on here. We got drivers that are shifting time arrivals in such a way whereas they're canceling each other out. So I thought, all right, let's move in the other direction now and let's see what it's doing. So we moved to the very edge of the panel on this side and took a measurement. And you can see it in purple. And that was the best measurement we could find, is measuring it right on this outside edge is where it measured the smoothest, but it was still really rough. And there was a big 7 kHz peak that is in the tweeter's response that is in every measurement. That thing has a big peak right there. It needed help, and the stock crossover did nothing to attenuate that peak. These are very simple filters that are on this thing. So we had that to deal with. Next, we set it up to where we could start measuring it off axis. And this, I could already tell from what we were doing that this was going to be problematic. What I could tell already, like I said, is the drivers are overlapping on top of each other. The woofer panel with no network on it actually played about 10 kHz. The mid-range panel also played almost 10 kHz, and the tweeters played way down to below 1,000. So the drivers' ranges were there, and we didn't even need a mid panel. This thing really does not need the panel that acts as a mid panel. The woofer panel could go straight to the tweeter. These things could be closer together and narrower, and would be no problem at all. No issues with the drivers reaching each other. They have plenty of range. So I realized, okay, I've got quite a bit to balance here too. So as we started going off axis, let's look at off axis towards the woofer. And this is where I'd say things were the best in that regard. So we're on the center of the panel and we're moving off 10 degrees each measurement. Now look at this measurement. The red line is on axis. That means directly in front of it. Orange is off 10 degrees. And as it starts to move off in that direction, it actually starts to become a little more balanced. But you'll see areas where there's dips where there wasn't a dip before, and peaks where there wasn't a peak before. That's because the changing time arrivals at a given frequency, it's arriving in phase at one frequency and then out of phase at another frequency. So you get this going on. So yellow is 20 degrees off axis. Green line is 30 degrees off axis, and the blue line is 40 degrees off axis. So you kind of have to look at them individually and look at each line and then go to the next color to realize what's really happening. And it's pretty rough. And then we did the same thing towards the tweeter axis. So we started in the middle and we went 10, 20, 30, 40 degrees off axis, going from red to orange to yellow to green and then to blue. And if you follow along there, you can see it's pretty much a disaster. I mean, as you move left or right, the frequency response of this whole speaker just completely changes. It gets really rough. Looking at the impedance curves, I could tell from the impedance that they're on top of each other as far as the drivers are playing on each other. It's a pretty low impedance speaker. There is a couple of low areas there where it dips to 2.32 ohms, right at about 650, and then up top around 8 kHz, it was at 2.67 ohms. So there was no reason for them to be that low of an impedance. The drivers themselves weren't that low. But like I said, there's multiple drivers playing over on top of each other through those same ranges, so it made the impedance really low. And so, wow. Okay, so that was what we needed to know going into it. We looked at the measurements. The next is figure out how to take this thing apart. So we had to clean off one of the work tables and use one of the big 4x8 tables and lay this thing down on something clean so that we'd protect the fabric here, the grill cloth. And there's a whole group of screws on the back side that we could undo. We had to take this stuff off. And once you undo all that, you can roll the fabric back to see everything that you need to work on the speaker. Now, the biggest and the hardest part to me, the part that I hate the most, is removing all the staples off the bottom of the speaker. There's one layer is folded over, it's all stapled on, and the next layer is folded over on that, and then it's all stapled on. So I'll throw up a picture of that so you can see just the whole line of staples that are just one right after another that you have to go in and remove all of those in order to be able to slide the sock down. And then I've got some pictures there of the old crossover. You can see they used iron core inductors on everything, and they use some small polycaps, and they stack the values to make the value that they want. Also, if you'll look, you'll notice the wiring, just PVC jacketed wiring, push-on connectors there on the terminals. The part that you see in red, that's what we highlighted in red so that we could see which ones were positive, and we did that by taking a measurement of the drivers independently with no network and looking at the impulse response to see which direction was positive and which direction was negative. Also, when we took this thing apart, we just gutted it. We just went in and started removing parts, just cutting them all off, getting this thing out of the path, and I'm not a big fan of these things. This is a magnet, and obviously it sticks to everything on here. These are steel lock screws that are on here. On the back side, the nuts that the entire signal is passing around and through, these are all steel. The backs of the fuse holders there, those are steel. This is just stuff you don't ever want in a signal path to any high-end speaker. And of course, there's two fuses on there. So there's a fuse on the mid and a fuse in the tweeter, and those are also not something you want in the signal path. I can understand them putting that in there to protect the drivers, but you're really just protecting them from high voltage, from a lot of power. But that's only part of what protects those drivers. It's not the power handling as far as just sheer amount of power that usually damages these things. So long as you've got clean power, they'll take quite a bit of power as far as peaks. What usually gets the tweeter or the mid panel is the fact that it's playing down so low that it begins to move so much. Its mechanical limits is what really hurts it. So tried to be sure when we went through and designed stuff for this that we were keeping that in mind and protecting especially the tweeter from playing down so low. I feel like right now with what we've designed for it, it's better protected by the crossover than it was originally with just the capacitors that it had on it and a fuse. It was allowed to play down really low, and it's a first order slope, so it carried well over into its FS, and when you put a lot of power on it, it may be stressed a little bit because it is playing down into pretty low frequency range. We did a second order filter on it and cut it a lot sharper, so it really doesn't play down as low, and it stays within its own range, and that helped out quite a bit. So let's look at what we were able to do with this, or what we did with this starting out, and how it sounded, and what led us to the next steps. So it's not a one and done kind of a process. When you're working on a speaker like this, even if you're looking at the measurements and you're voicing it fairly smooth, you also have to take into account that there's some room reflection in that. There's a floor reflection that's part of this response of the speaker, and it's going to be there in the room. And we had it up off of the floor a little bit to minimize some of that. So things are going to change when you put it in the room and you set it up and start listening to it. So it was important that we did that on this speaker, and I'm really glad we did. Let's start by looking at the on-axis frequency response. You can see that it's much flatter now. We made it nice and as smooth as we could given what the output of the drivers were all the way across. We had a pretty aggressive notch filter at 7 kHz on the tweeter that took that big peak and pulled it down so that it was nice and smooth and balanced everything out. We have drivers operating within their own ranges. If we look at the crossover response, you can see the mid level is brought down quite a bit, and it's kind of used as a filler driver. So there's not near as much power going to this mid as what it used to have. There's a pretty good resistor in line with it, bringing it down. And the tweeter and we'll call it the base panel, or sometimes I still refer to it as the woofer panel. Those two could have easily just crossed to one another without the mid in there. But the mid also is filling a gap in the space there so that the acoustic centers are kept close to each other. So it's important that all of that work properly. And I use kind of a filler driver concept. So you can see they sum perfectly flat. The tweeter's rolling off, the woofer level or the bass panel is rolling off, and the mid one is just filling in there, and they all sum. They're all acoustically in phase, and all that looked really good. The impedance is more representative of something with an actual crossover there, because we got a little rise there as the crossover is causing some reactance there. And that notch filter, I wasn't really happy with that. That notch filter was dropping it back down to that 2.6 range, right there where it needed to be pulled down, and I really couldn't get around it. It really needed to be pulled down. Now back and forth with different resistor values, bringing the impedance up a little bit, and then that peak would come back up. So I kind of had to find a happy median. I don't like impedances that low, but it was that low already, and it's pretty high up in frequency, so there's not a real current demand at that frequency way up there versus where it was before. The impedance was pretty low, even down low, so it was demanding a lot of current. So we put all that together, set up the pair, and started listening. And of course the speakers were fresh, the crossovers were fresh, everything was fresh, nothing's been burned in. And these things sounded really thin. I mean, really thin. Almost just too bright up top. And having done this a lot, I know what the sound is of the crossovers when the crossovers need more burn-in time. I know exactly how that sounds, and I know exactly what to expect when they've got some time on them, how that's going to smooth out, how things are going to soften. And this was more than just that. And a lot of it was actually the drivers themselves needed some time, needed to loosen up, especially that bass driver. I guess it's pretty tight from the get-go, and it just needs to be worked a little bit to loosen up the compliance or something. But it was really thin sounding, and it made me go back and remeasure and relook at it and compare what I'm hearing to what the measurements looked like. And I felt like, so that the in-room response is more normal, the response that I get measuring it like I was measuring it needed to be readjusted. I needed to take the top end where the tweeter was, and I needed to bring that down a little bit and make more of a downward slope. So went back and did that, and it sounded much better, much more normal. It sounded balanced. So let's take a look at the new and the final frequency response. You can see the tweeter levels brought down a little bit, and it had really, really good sound to it. There's some things that are phenomenal about this thing, and I'll come back to that. We're going to talk about exactly how it sounds now versus what was going on before, and the strengths and the weaknesses of the speaker. But first, let's look at the response now in the off axis, now that the drivers are playing within their own ranges and they're not playing on top of each other. In other words, when I say on top of each other, I mean the drivers were playing the same frequency range. The tweeter, the mid was on top of each other, the mid, the bass panel, all that was stacked up, playing the same ranges. So when you move left or right, the time arrival differential, which is pretty great on the speaker, would cause cancellation effects. So that has been solved a lot. Let's look at the new horizontal off axis moving towards the tweeter. So this was where it was the worst before. Again, the measurements are taken on axis. That's red line, and then orange, yellow, green, and blue moving 10 degrees each time. So 10, 20, 30, and 40 degrees off axis. You can see now the frequency response hardly changes. So you can move left or right, and there's really no change at all. The reflections you're going to get off the sidewalls even are going to be very much like the on-axis response, so much more even all over. Moving towards the woofer, being on-axis and moving towards the woofer. Things started to change a little, 30 to 40 degrees off-axis, but 10 and 20 degrees off-axis still looked really good, much better than it did. You've really got to get pretty far off-axis for it to really start changing. So I feel like these are going to be best set up with the mid panels to the inside. That's going to focus your vocals and your imaging and the distance that you have them apart from each other versus the distance that they are from you. That's your axis of what you're trying to use as the focus. The tweeters being to the outside are going to open the soundstage up a little more than if they were on the inside. And it's going to give you better sidewall reflections because to the tweeter axis, it's smoother going that direction versus to the woofer axis. So it's going to be more balanced that way, and they sounded really good. Looking at the final impedance curves, we still dropped a little above 2 ohms, right up there at that notch filter, but the rest of the speaker is pretty much 4 ohms all the way across. And the spectral decay on that, I didn't show you some of these earlier. It was really, really rough. This is smoother than it has been. There are some little bits of ringing going on in these panels, but it's down in output. It doesn't start at a peak and just continue to ring. It drops off, and there's a little bit of residual ring going on. You can see it there at the tweeters range, way up top there, and then a few there at the bottom of the tweeters range or the mid panel. There's a few areas there where you can see a little ringing going on, but overall, not that bad. And the improvements in clarity and detail and things like that were improved dramatically. And let's take a look at why. This is the new crossover boxes. We made these for external mount. These crossovers are just not going to fit inside the speaker very well, so they had to go in a box and be mounted externally. So that means when you go in and you operate on the insides of these things and you take all these parts off, you have to run new wiring, and I recommend running our new wiring, which is high purity OFC copper and polyethylene. Use that on the the mid and the woofer panels, and run it straight to the tube connectors. And then the tweeter, you're going to have to reuse the wiring that's already on it, because that wiring is built onto the tweeter and coming off the tweeter. I didn't see any terminals or anything where I could push a new wire on or solder a new wire to it. Maybe way over on it and way up to the top. If I took the whole thing apart, maybe I could get to the point where I could reattach wiring. I don't recommend it. It's a lot easier to use the wiring that's already on it, so I recommend doing that. And wiring all 6 of those wires to new tube connectors. Let me show you a picture of the back of it with the new tube connectors on it, and made a little wood panel that's the same size as what this one is, and just mounted that right to the back and mount the tube connectors in it. If there's any way you guys who are really interested in this speaker and you want our network on it, you might talk to the guys over at Magnepan and just send them the tube connectors and have them mount that into a little wood panel on the back, just like we did, in place of all of this. And then all you have to do is mount your crossover externally and just plug it in. You won't have to disassemble the whole speaker. They may even continue to warranty it, because the crossover I've designed for it is going to protect the tweeter in the mid more so than what they had on it before. This little parts that they had on it before, plus a fuse. You know, like I said, the fuse may blow at a certain voltage levels, but it's the mechanical limits that really start coming into play, and now the tweeter's not playing down near as low, so that helps a lot. And the mid's not playing down all the way on top of the mid, or on top of the base panel either. It's playing within its own range, so it's going to handle a whole lot more power now than it did before. So they may even go ahead and warrant it and still mount everything to tube connectors and send it out to you. I don't know. You're going to have to chat with those guys about it if you want to do that. Otherwise, you will have to disassemble these things just like we did, which is kind of a pain in the butt. The disassembly and reassembly is a lot more difficult than just putting the crossover together. And I'm going to give you a good look at the crossover. What we did here is we used some big poly caps on the base circuit, bypassed by a sonic cap. We used the big air core inductors from US Coils. The mid is it's a low order filter on the mid. We've got a big resistor in line with it there. We've got a sonic cap. We've got another big coil from US Coils, and we've got a second order on the top of it helping create that roll. The tweeter, we've got a second order filter on it, also using the sonic cap and air core inductors from US Coils. And then it's got that little notch filter on it, which is right here, that's bringing down that peak at 7K hertz. These parts need a couple hundred hours of burn-in. I'm sure the panels need probably at least that much as well to be completely burned in. We've probably got it about halfway there. And I have to tell you, they are pretty special. The Magnepan product is a great product, and when you do things like this to it, to take it to another level, it is very impressive. Things I liked about it, the detail levels of the tweeter and the mid-range especially is beautiful. I was able to lock things in really well, center of the sound stage. Layering was not too bad. Soundstage was nice and wide. It had good presentation to it. Couple of the drawbacks, the panel is pretty wide. Anytime you got a panel that's that wide, you do get a perception of sound coming from the panel because the panel is so huge. It's like listening to a big in-wall speaker. A smaller speaker that has less surface area tends to be more transparent. It tends to sound more as if the sound is all coming from behind the speaker and you don't really hear anything from the speaker because you don't have any surface reflection or any area there that it's playing from. Whereas this big of a speaker, it does tend to have a sound as if it's playing from the panels a little more so than a lot of other speakers. But a lot of transparency front to back. The tweeter is really transparent, really delicate and detailed. It's a beautiful sound, and if you love mid-range, you're going to love these speakers. Weakness for me still was bass response, and it just doesn't have the impact of a bunch of dynamic drivers. However, I was driving it with an amplifier or a pair of monoblocks. They were rated at 60 watts into 8 ohms and 120 into 4 ohms. So I was giving it 100 watt peaks, and I can tell you right now that's not near enough. They need a lot more power. If you had a 300 or 400 watt amp on these things so that you've got some headroom and you've got some drive there to hit some good peaks, it may open these up a little more, and it may have a lot more drive down on the bottom end and a lot better dynamics. They just need power, and that's another kind of a drawback to the Maggie speaker. They're a low impedance that need a lot of power, so you're going to spend a little bit on an amplifier. And of course, most of you Maggie guys, you know that, but that is something you're going to have to keep in mind when you go to some of these big Magnepan speakers. But all in all, they did sound really nice, and I was able to blend them with our triple open baffle servo subs, which match with them really well. And that filled out the bottom end, made them flat to 20. Once I got it all tweaked in, yeah, pretty nice presentation, really nice. So how much for the kit? How much for all the parts? So you get all of these parts for the pair. Lots of tube connectors. There's a pair, a set for the input, and there's 3 sets on the speaker. So there's 4 sets of tube connectors there, which adds up. And some wiring. Everything came to $1,149 for everything. And that included a little Gen 3 bypass cap on the sonic cap that's in the tweeter circuit. And you will also get our support and our help through the whole thing. And I know a lot of you guys that are working on these things, you're going to call us and say, hey, how do I this or that? And that's okay. We're here for you, and we'll help you through each part of the process. Again, check with Magnepan if you're ordering these new, if there's any way they can send it out with no crossover. They don't have to spend the money on the parts going out. All they have to do is just wire it to some terminals and send it out, so it would save them some money, and it may even be faster to assemble. And if it's done at that point versus you having to take it all apart, all the better. I would feel like they would probably feel more comfortable continuing to warranty the speaker knowing it's got a well-designed crossover on it than knowing that the customer is having to take the whole thing apart and try and get it all back together and everything else. If you don't have to take it apart, again, it's going to be a whole lot easier. But you guys will have to chat with them about that. If they have any questions about it, you can have them give me a call. And that is it for this one. I hope you guys liked it. And it was a challenging build. And on to the next one. We've got a lot lined up in there still, and I got a lot more to do. I appreciate you guys tuning in. Please hit the subscribe button if you haven't, and we'll see you in the next video.